Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrea Akins, and I'm the Digital Marketing Specialist here at Frank Crum. Today's topic is how to effectively handle employee corrective actions. During the presentation, if you have a question, please type it in the questions box that's located on the right side of your screen. We will be able to answer your questions live during the webinar, and Frank Crum's Human Resources Consultant, Nanette Madera, will host a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. If we could not get to your question at the end, we will answer you via email. We will also email you a recording of this webinar next week along with the slides. Now, I know many of our Frank Crum clients are on this call today, and I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you for your business. We sincerely appreciate it. And for those who are not our active clients, welcome. I'd like to start with a brief overview of our business, and then I will introduce our speaker for today. Frank Crum is a family-owned organization that is located in beautiful Clearwater, Florida, and has been in business for 35 years. Frank Crum companies consist of Frank Crum PEO, Frank Crum Staffing, and Frank Winston Crum Insurance. Frank Crum PEO, a professional employer organization, enables clients to cost-effectively outsource the management of human resources, employee benefits, payroll and payroll taxes, and workers' compensation. As a result, our clients can focus on what they do best to maintain and grow their bottom line. Now let's get started. Presenting today's webinar is Frank Crum's Human Resources Manager, Christine Paul. Christine is a certified professional in human resources, and she has over 20 years of HR-related experience with a background in labor and employment law. She also manages Frank Advice, our premium HR consultant service that we provide to our clients. With Frank Advice, you could get instant access to experts like Christine to answer all your HR-related questions. Now, welcome Christine Paul.
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome today. We all appreciate you all joining us today. As she said, we're going to provide you with some helpful guidance that should help you solve some problems with your employees and hopefully retain good talent through corrective action techniques that are appropriate for different scenarios. Corrective action is one of the most common topics that we consult on. We talk to thousands of employers each year, and usually it's usually towards the end of the process that they needed to consult sooner. So this topic is very important to implement ahead of time. If you're calling us because you want to terminate somebody but you haven't used corrective action measures, you're probably going to have to wait and see what else you should do first. So the goal with corrective action is to solve the problem and maintain the relationship. It's not, it shouldn't be used just to punish someone. The idea is to fix the problem and everybody moves on productively. Some of the benefits of corrective action or having appropriate measures in place include longevity, the longevity of your staff. Once you have a good group in place, you certainly want to keep them around. Also, equitable treatment and sense of fairness. Another way to keep people to stay put is because they feel like their employer is fair and that they treat everyone the same. So that's a good retention tool as well. Another benefit is to lower the recruitment and training expenses. Statistics show that it costs on average $4,000 for each new hire. So including your advertising, recruiting, and the time it takes to review people and the hiring process and so on. So that's certainly a good reason to try and develop and keep a good staff. Another benefit is avoidance of costly legal fees. In the event you ultimately do terminate somebody, the documentation you've accumulated about the steps you took to try to correct the problem, even if it wasn't successful, can certainly help you defend allegations that they were terminated for some unlawful reason. So problems rarely go away on their own. So you want to take the steps to either fix them or have all your, your documentation in place should you find yourself in a position that you are going to decide to terminate someone. So why corrective action? Why? What is the purpose and what are we trying to communicate to the employees? So first, it's partly disciplinary. Again, you don't want it to only punish somebody, but it's a step in correcting the problem. You've probably heard corrective action referred to as disciplinary action, but that's only part of the puzzle. You don't want it to just punish, though some adverse action at some point during the process may be necessary in order for the employee to know that you mean business. I mean, if you just keep telling them, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, and nothing happens, then of course that's probably not going to curtail the behavior. So you do want to at some point take some action if they in fact are not improving. Progressive action. Generally, the idea is that it's a progressive approach, starting with a certain level, going to the next, maybe a final warning, and then before termination, and then termination. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. You've probably heard it called progressive discipline, but it makes sense that it's progressive in the event that if the infractions are the same or similar level. The idea is that you would start on a level that's appropriate for the action, and ideally that would fix it the first time. Wouldn't that be nice? But a progressive approach just makes sense for most issues. Some more serious infractions may warrant skipping steps in the process, or even could warrant immediate termination, even if no other steps have taken place. For example, major safety violations, or being under the influence of drugs at work, or even sexual harassment. Those types of issues might be serious enough to warrant immediate termination, even if they had never been written up before. And ideally, it's corrective. In other words, that's why we call it corrective action, and that's the idea, is that you address the problem with the employee and they fix it, and in turn go back to being a productive employee. This way everybody wins. The employee gets to keep their job, and you save money because you don't have to find a new employee and go through all those recruiting, the time and expense to recruit and hire somebody. So let's talk about some of the steps involved that can be taken in the corrective action process. Over the next few slides, I'll be going through the things to consider to take the following steps. You're going to want to first identify the problem. Obviously, you want to know what the issue is and be ready to document that. Determine, based on what you've discovered, what the appropriate corrective action would be. Once you've decided those two things, you want to meet and communicate with the employee that needs to focus on improving their behavior. And then, very importantly, you're going to want to document and follow up with the employee. So, identifying the problem. What is the issue that needs to be fixed? What can I see, hear, or measure? In other words, what could you actually write down on a piece of paper? Some things are kind of hard to put your finger on, so you want to be specific about what the problem is so that you can document it accordingly and then handle it moving forward. In other words, what am I observing that is wrong or needs to be fixed? You'll want to consider, is it performance, attendance, or conduct? So in other words, performance, are they performing their job properly, or are they maybe not meeting the quotas established for their position? Attendance, is the person tardy all the time, or they have excessive absenteeism, or they're not following the policy about calling off? And then conduct, if you have policies about workplace conduct, is the person not following these rules? Maybe they're arguing with coworkers, or taking too many breaks or lengthy breaks, or whatever the conduct might be that is unacceptable. Those are the things you want to identify what the problem is as your first step. You'll want to do some analysis and some questions you can kind of ask yourself. You want to determine what needs to be addressed and why, and then determine the action to take. So analyze by asking, what is the impact of this activity on the business? Why does it matter? Why should it be corrected? Does it affect co-workers, or does it affect the workflow, or does it just make the employee not productive and therefore not useful if they're not performing their job up to par? What impact does it have on the business? Does the employee know the activity should or should not occur? In other words, do you have policies that they are violating? Do they even know? You'd be surprised how many employees don't really know that they're doing something wrong if it's something, that maybe they didn't understand the instructions or whatnot. Does the employee know what is supposed to be done? Have they been given clear instructions? Or what, was the orientation and training conducted appropriately? Sometimes they get off to a start without any training or instruction. They don't really know enough to even ask questions. You don't realize that they don't know it. Then they come to a point where all of a sudden they're not performing, and it's just because that from the get-go, possibly they weren't trained or they weren't provided appropriate instructions on how to do their job. So also, are there obstacles beyond the employee's control? You'll want to consider whether there could be underlying issues that need to be addressed. For example, if they're not performing well or they're coming in late, first, get some information from them. Ask what you can do to help. Ask, what is, here's the problem. It's not acceptable, but what can we do to fix it? Or maybe what is the cause? This, in fact, could be the beginning of what is known as the interactive process. In the, this might uncover that they have some type of disability and they need an accommodation. So don't always just assume they're a slacker. Always just take an objective approach and see if you can get to the bottom of what the problem is, what the cause of it might be, and what can be done to fix it, even if it means there might be something on your part that you can do to help the employee improve. Also, you want to consider, does the employee know how to perform the desired activity correctly? Again, was training done in the beginning, or were they doing it wrong for so long that nobody noticed and they needed to catch it sooner and they needed some follow-up training? Or is it just that they've had all the training and you keep trying and they just don't have the skills necessary for the job? Sometimes you've come to the end of your rope on that, and you might discover that they're not qualified, but you should take enough steps ahead of time to before you make that determination. Also, you want to consider, is the employee willing and capable of performing and or behaving as expected? Like I mentioned, do they actually have the skills to perform the job? And if so, are they willing to do so? If they just kind of have an attitude and they're not really on board, you might not really have good success even with corrective action if they just really don't have the desire or the will to perform the job accordingly. Also, you want to consider, what do you anticipate the employee's thoughts and comments to be? This is something that hopefully you or your managers kind of know your employees well enough that you can plan ahead for the employee's reaction so that you're well equipped to formulate an appropriate response. And I'll be touching base on this a little bit later when we discuss the meeting and communication portion. So next, you want to determine the type of corrective action that would be appropriate by thinking about what types of things to consider. In other words, you want to make sure that it makes sense based on what the issue is. For example, how serious of an event is it? Is it something minor that just a verbal warning would be appropriate, like they came in 5 minutes late and or they just weren't working at their workstation at the start time because they get coffee first, and maybe it's just not anything major but worth mentioning because you do really want them to be at their workstation working when the start of their shift. Or is it something more serious, like a harassment issue that might warrant skipping a few steps and going right to either a suspension or maybe a termination? So you want to make sure that you're considering the seriousness of the event before you decide what kind of action you're going to take. Also, you'll want to consider what the employee's history with the company is. Have they otherwise been a good employee, or are they a frequent offender? Or have they had similar problems, or is this just completely something out of the blue? There's a variety of things to consider with an employee's history. If it's something that they just are a repeat offender, and you've gone through several steps of the process, and maybe you're at the end of the process again, and you're considering termination. That's one thing. Or maybe they've otherwise been a really great employee, and you want to have a conversation with them to really get down to maybe what the problem is. Maybe they have some personal issues going on. Not that that's an excuse, but certainly it might explain the behavior, and you can kind of sort through, what needs to happen for them to correct it, even if it might mean, some time away from work or whatever the case may be. You'll want to consider if they're in their first 90 days of employment, for example. Not that it changes everything. You still, you still don't have to have a reason for termination, even if it's after 90 days. But generally, if you're already having issues early on, you'll really want to think hard about whether or not it's something to work on, or if it's better to part ways. You sometimes can get a general idea if, suddenly they just really are not, doing well and maybe not a good fit. So, depending on what the issue is, you'll want to consider also the previously discussed things, like how serious is it, and just in general, if it's something that you think really just needs to be addressed by the company, and that they can, be improved. So, if they need more training, or if you have policies in place, and so on. Also, you want to consider, has the employee been allowed to tell his or her account of the activity, and are those comments noted? Certainly you want to make sure they get to tell their side of the story before moving right on to taking corrective action. It doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to change your mind, but it certainly is prudent to get their side of the story, to see again if something else is needed on your part to help them improve and keep them on the right track. You also want to consider what proof exists that the activity occurred. In other words, we talked earlier about, what you see, hear, or measure. If, is the behavior something that you witnessed? Is it something that's easily tracked, like tardiness with time clock records? Is it something that's easily identifiable, like their poor work product, missing deadlines, or low sales, or something like that? Or what else do you have that would show that the activity actually, that the problem actually exists to the extent that it needs to be addressed with corrective action? And likewise, have witnesses been interviewed, and are their statements documented and signed? Depending on the issue, oftentimes you may need to get some additional information about what happened. Again, if you haven't yourself witnessed it, you might need to see who, what other people were involved, and get their account of the story. A lot of times you get a he said, she said type scenario, and you really want to get all the facts from anybody who might have information before you make a determination about what type of corrective action you're going to use. For example, in an extreme example, if an employee complained that another employee harassed them, you definitely want to immediately initiate an investigation, get statements from coworkers who may know or may have seen something to back up or refute the allegations before you take some action. And speaking of investigations, you definitely want to be sure that, has the investigation been thorough? Was it objective and timely completed with the appropriate personnel, regardless of how, it appears on its face? You don't want to pass judgment, you don't want to insert anybody's opinions, and you don't want to just automatically assume it's true. You definitely want to, conduct investigations so that you have as many facts as you can gather in order to make an informed decision about any corrective action. And this one is really important. Has the organization enforced rules and standards consistently? How have other employees in similar situations been treated? This is a biggie when it comes to a particular scenario comes up. If you don't have policies in place, and or you've just kind of been willy-nilly about how you've implemented them, you definitely can face some issues when it comes to implementing corrective action only with certain people. So if you're going to, write someone up, or you're going to maybe reduce their wages or suspend them or even terminate them, if that isn't how you've treated others in the past for, similar circumstances, you certainly can run into some allegations of discrimination because you're not treating everybody the same. And again, like I mentioned earlier, fairness and being treated equally is something that is more likely to make people want to stay. You'll also want to consider if the corrective action measure fits the infraction, and make sure the punishment fits the crime, so to speak. So, if the person is, 5 minutes late and they typically are, reporting on time, you probably aren't going to suspend them for a week for that. So you want to just kind of, use some common sense about what the appropriate action would be. Also, what you want to, kind of be prepared to document and relay to the employee what they have to do to correct their issue. Have a plan already in place before you talk to them based on, again, what you've observed, what the problem is, how serious it is, and then what you're going to tell them that they need to do. And you want to be able to be very clear about that so that they don't have any, opportunity to say, oh, well, I didn't understand what you meant, or I didn't know what I needed to do, and so on. So you really want to be clear about what is expected of the employee. To be effective when preparing the written documentation about the corrective action, you'll want to really consider the importance of how you phrase things. In other words, you want to avoid using time frames like 30, 60, 90 days. You don't need to say, hey, okay, well, you have 60 days to fix this, or in 60 days we're going to revisit this. This can give the employee the idea that they kind of have extra time to continue the bad behavior, or that you're not really going to be paying attention during those 60 days. So it doesn't give them any sense of urgency. Likewise with probationary or numbering warnings, like this is your first, second, third. It can give the impression that they have a few more chances before it's serious, and you want to make sure that they understand that it's serious now, and that's why you're addressing it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be saying, you wouldn't be meeting with them if it wasn't. So you want to use terms like immediate. Immediate, significant, and consistent improvement is necessary to avoid termination of your employment. Meaning the problem has already been addressed. We expect immediate improvement, and we'll review these matters on an ongoing basis as necessary. Not we'll revisit and take a peek in 60 days. We'll review them on an ongoing basis. So we're going to be keeping our eye on you because, we expect you to correct the problem right away. So let's talk about some options of what types of corrective actions to consider. An informal verbal counseling. This might be a first step, if it's just like I mentioned before, maybe somebody was just 5 minutes late, or they go to get their coffee first when they get there, and then they sit down, 10 after 8 and get started, and you really prefer that they're at their workstation and working, at 8 rather than getting their coffee. So something that's probably, maybe they're a new employee and they don't really, understand that, or whatever the case may be. It can be something pretty informal. A verbal warning, likewise, not as serious, obviously, as some other infractions, but, and by the way, just because it's verbal, you do want to write it down. Verbal just kind of refers to sort of the level of seriousness, and maybe you're not going to hand them a write-up, so to speak, but you're going to document that you had the conversation. You're going to document that, oh, hey, Sally was late again. I already told her I want her at her desk at 8. So I'm giving her a verbal warning that, if she doesn't shape up, she could be written up and maybe at some point terminated. Which brings us to the next, a written warning. A written warning is appropriate for many types of incidents, so it doesn't mean that they have to have already had a verbal warning to have a written warning. If it's something that is serious enough that you're just going to write them up for, then that's fine. The written warning is just that. You're going to write it down, communicate the issue to the employee, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and then that's a document that you're going to provide to them, have them sign it, you sign it, and it's going to be kept in their personnel file. Another type of corrective action might include decision-making leave or a suspension. This might not necessarily be a step that is taken in every circumstance, but things that require additional investigation to decide what you're going to do might warrant leave or a suspension. In the example of like sexual harassment, for example, you definitely want to get right on it and start investigating, but you also probably want to remove the alleged harasser from the work site. For a number of reasons, but one is to just allow you time to investigate, gather facts, decide what you're going to do, whether you're going to bring them back or whether you're going to ultimately term them, depending on what your investigation uncovers. So this is something for some serious infractions that require a little more investigation. If it's something that like tardiness or something that is, doesn't require more information, I don't know that that's necessarily an appropriate step, although it could be if you just want to give them like a final warning, like, hey, I'm going to suspend you for a week without pay. When you come back, if you're late one more time, you're going to be fired. You can use that step as a final warning. Others just use a written warning and include a final warning and just make it clear that, the next step is going to be termination, which is the next step, termination. So the key is really, and again, some things warrant immediate termination. I mean, if somebody's, taking drugs on a work site and they're caught, red-handed, that might be something that would warrant immediate termination. Maybe you're in a safety-sensitive industry that you just have zero tolerance for drugs, or any industry that has zero tolerance for drugs. It's something that is not taken lightly and should not be, and that might warrant immediate termination even if they've never had a warning or a counseling in the past. So again, you'll want to consider the nature of the infraction and the history with the employee, and then make some decisions from there on what you're going to do. So the next step is meeting and communicating. Now you've analyzed what the problem is, what the appropriate action would be to take, and now you want to meet and communicate this information to the employee. Okay, this is a very important step because obviously if they're expected to improve, they need to know what the problem is and they need to know what you expect from them. So you want, as far as the conversation, you want to start out with I and not you. You don't want to immediately be pointing the finger like you did this and or you have to do that or you're wrong and so on. You just want to start with the purpose of the meeting. I wanted to talk to you about some areas that need improvement. You don't want to start it off that the employee is already on the defense or feeling like you're attacking them. That's never going to bring a good result or reaction. So just state the purpose of the meeting and go on from there. You want to be sure that you aren't generalizing or judging. Be objective, not emotional. You're not there to point the finger or scold the employee. You're there to talk about the facts. What is the issue? What needs to happen to fix it? While you might experience an emotional response from the employee, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, the more neutral that you can remain, the more effective the delivery of the communication will be, and it will help you diffuse some of their emotional reactions as well, as if you can remain calm. You want to discuss the desired versus actual. This is pretty self-explanatory. You're basically saying, here's what the issue is, here's where you are, but here's where you need to be. You can reference policies that may apply or specific incidents of performance issues. Like here's what our policy is on when your work time starts, and here's, what's been happening. So that's the part we need to fix, those types of things. And again, some employees, you'd be surprised that they don't realize that it's a big deal. In other words, just like in that example, maybe they just figured, nah, that's what everybody does, I'm going to do it too, or they just aren't really even thinking. They're like, well, I show up at 8 and that's when I start working, even though I'm still getting my coffee and chatting until 8:10. So, address the policies and just make it clear that, okay, well, that really isn't acceptable, and so here's what I expect you to do moving forward. State the step. You want to be clear about what the next steps will be. Not only what you are doing, but what is expected from the employee. So you're going to say, well, here's what I'm going to do. We're going to monitor your performance, for example, or whatever the case may be. And also be clear what will happen if either they improve, maybe, hey, if you get your sales back up in 6 months, we'll consider a salary increase, or or you also want to be clear what will happen if they don't. If you don't start showing up on time, you could be written up or even terminated. So be clear about what's going to happen, what can happen if they improve, and what can happen if they do not. You also want to gain agreement on the problem and solution. This one's kind of tricky because they're going to be like, sometimes they're like, I didn't do anything wrong, or this isn't that bad, or whatever. But it is important to gain agreement, because once you've provided the details, you want to make sure they're on the same page. So you'll want to ask them if they understand, why you're meeting today, if they understand the issue. Be sure and ask them if they have any questions, because you want to make sure that they are clear on what the issue is and why it's an issue. And if they don't, or if they just have an attitude and you can tell they're just absolutely not, in agreement and have no interest in fixing it, that might kind of thwart the process of corrective action altogether. And ultimately, you never know, it could change the meeting. I mean, it might get you to the point where, it's going to end up in a termination rather than another step in the corrective action process. And again, you want to state clearly what will happen next. You've brought the problem to light. You've discussed where you need the employee to be or what you need them to do. You've gotten confirmation, hopefully, that they understand and agree that it's a problem, and certainly that they understand what the solution needs to be and what is expected of them. So you want to be clear what the next steps will be for improvement. Again, for example, I expect you to be on time every day. I expect you to be, you can come in and get your coffee, but I want you to be seated and on the phone at 8 a.m. You're expected to complete all your projects on time, or you must immediately stop doing whatever. You want to be very clear about this is what's going to happen and what we expect of you. And then you want to respond to the employee's emotions effectively. As I mentioned, when employees feel they're in trouble, so to speak, they can sometimes get emotional. Nobody likes to really be, approached with problems at work. And so they can be emotional. And while you don't want to just completely ignore it or discard it, you also don't want to respond in an emotional manner. That's just going to add fuel to the fire and really not get, allow you to make any progress. So let's talk about some reactions you might encounter and how, and some ideas of how to handle them. Depending on the individual and the nature of the issues, you might encounter a variety of reactions from employees, and how you react to them or respond can really help keep things from getting derailed. It's never a bad idea to have another individual as a witness during a coaching meeting, and especially if you are concerned that the person may have an exceptionally negative reaction and things might get out of hand. I've spoken to a number of employers that, they kind of know the personality of the employee, and they're kind of a hothead, and they were kind of concerned about how they might react for, the coaching. And so it's always a good idea to have, if possible, somebody else on hand that can be there in the event something kind of goes south, and also as a witness. Um, and obviously, again, if the reaction is severe enough, you might have a change of plans during your meeting and terminate them immediately. Obviously, ideally, the plan is to stay on track, get through the process effectively, and everybody wins. But some people really cannot, you know, control or accept criticism, and they act inappropriately that, it changes the course of the meeting. So, for example, anger and intimidation. Nobody likes to be confronted with problems, which again, that's why your approach is important. If the employee gets angry, maybe just let them vent a little, maybe even take a short break, allow them to cool off, and then regroup. If they really, again, just cannot get it together, if it's so severe, it could change the course of what you thought you were going to do. Tears, emotional despair. Um, there's always a possibility that the employee will be upset and cry. Some employees are simply embarrassed when their bad behavior is discovered and addressed, or they might just be suddenly worried, that they're going to lose their job. Maybe this is the first time they're being written up, or maybe it's been a couple times and they're really nervous, and then all of a sudden, it all starts coming down on them and they're in panic mode, which is understandable. You don't want to you do want to make it clear that they certainly could lose their job if they don't straighten up. I mean, you don't want to sugarcoat it to the extent that you're like, oh no, your job is protected, or guarantee that they won't get fired. That's never prudent. But when the tears start flowing, you want to try to just treat the reaction as genuine. Give them a minute to kind of contain themselves, and then hopefully, they can pull it together and you can continue with the meeting. Complaining and blaming. Depending on the individual and the maturity of the individual, a common reaction, I think, when the heat is on, is to not want to take responsibility for their own actions or to blame others. So now, while you don't really have to discount what they're saying altogether and assume there's absolutely no merit to it whatsoever, you do want to make it clear that right now, this meeting, the focus is on the employee, but that you're willing to hear their complaints later. In other words, they're saying, well, yeah, but this happened and this happened. Well, even though they didn't already tell you that, it's okay. This might be an opportunity to bring something else to light that needs to be addressed about the company or another employee, and that's fine. But you want to keep on track with the purpose of this particular meeting, the corrective action with the employee, and that you're happy to meet with them at a later time to discuss their complaints that are now just coming up. The silent treatment, sometimes they just don't have any reaction, don't know what to say. You want to try to keep the interaction going between you and the employee, to ensure that that they've understood what the problem is and what is expected of them. If they just freeze up and don't say anything, try engaging them by asking questions, open-ended questions. Maybe ask them to tell you, certainly you want to ask them to tell you their side of the story. Maybe pause, give them time to regroup their thoughts, give them time to formulate a response. You could also ask them things like, what steps do you feel you could take to improve in this area? Or are there other things that I should consider that I haven't already talked about in this meeting? I mean, maybe they have some ideas or input that would help, because maybe they have some ideas that would help them do a better job or improve. And again, that's the idea. You want to fix the problem and allow them to continue their employment with you. You may, however, have some people who are just unwilling to resolve the problem. Again, it's essential to gain the agreement on the problem and the steps necessary to remedy the problem. If you just come to an impasse and they are just absolutely unwilling to resolve it, you're probably wasting your time to continue the employment if you're gonna just find yourself in this position a week from now, or if they just refuse to improve at all. That doesn't help the individual, it doesn't help the coworkers, and it doesn't help um, the employee. So or the company. So you'll need to, reiterate that it's imperative that they agree that they're going to work on it or improve or whatever the course of action you had established, or that if not, it will lead to their termination. You want to be very clear about that so that they, there should be no surprises when they ignore you and it does, nothing changes and then they get fired. Documentation and follow-up. This might be the most important step of the corrective action process, because while the previous steps are geared towards saving or retaining the employee, the documentation could actually save you money. So some things to consider about your documentation. You want to make sure it's dated, neat, factual. In other words, avoid drawing conclusions. Just facts. Don't put your opinions, no judgments, no anything else. Just record the facts and make sure it's signed. Remember earlier I mentioned that even if the warning is verbal, that only means it's a little early in the process or a little less serious. It does not mean only verbal. You should always document the incident so that you have that, chain of events that in the event it leads to other corrective action or possibly termination, you want to make sure you have that in order. Be sure to date them so that you always have kind of a chronology of events that led to the next level, or to or in the event it led to termination. Sometimes it's easy to keep kind of a corrective action log. In other words, if you have in your personnel files all the write-ups, and even though they're dated, you still have to rifle through them to kind of get things in order and get kind of the chain of events. If you keep just a main log on the top of the personnel file with just the basics, maybe the date and the general, incident, general description of the incident, sometimes that helps just to give you an at-a-glance view of the events that would lead to the next level or to term. You want to be sure and sign the documents and have the employees sign as well. I understand they don't always want to, because they're like, I'm not admitting to anything, or I don't agree, or this isn't right, or I don't deserve this. You're going to hear that, but again, you want to back up, make sure you're in agreement, make sure they're on the same page, and then you want to make sure that they sign it because this acknowledges that you've had this conversation with them, that you've provided them a copy of the write-up, which is important. It's not a secret. That's why you're talking to them about it. So you can and should, you should give them a copy, so for their files as well. And then of course you're going to keep a copy in the personnel file. So just, stick with the facts. You want to document what happened, what was discussed or agreed to in the meeting, what your expectations are for improvement, and what the next steps will be, or what could the consequences be if they improve or they don't. You want to make sure that they're written with diplomacy and professionalism. As I mentioned earlier, you want to stick to the facts. No judging, no emotion. This is not an opportunity to bash the employee or put the employee down. It's called corrective for a reason. The purpose is to point out the problem, and hopefully they correct it and become a productive and valuable employee again. That's the idea. You want to write them with the expectation that someone else could see it. Your personnel files don't get sealed permanently and nobody has access to them. I mean, you can have a policy that you don't provide it to, termed employees in most states. However, you would have to supply copies in the event there was either an unemployment hearing or a lawsuit, a charge in front of the EEOC. So you want to be sure that you're documenting things factually and professionally, that in the event that someone else saw it, you aren't sinking your own ship with, your extra little side comments and notes. I've seen that happen a number of times in lawsuits, that people have made notes that have not done them any favors. So you want to make sure that that does not happen to you. And again, you want to focus on confronting and fixing the problem, not punishing the employee. Anytime an employee or former employee brings a cause of action against his or her employer, there's a chance that these documents from the individual's personnel file will be required to be handed over. In the process of discovery in litigation, the parties can request, and you're required to produce, that the other party, turn over certain documents that are pertinent to the case, or a subpoena could be served that you have to produce those documents. So you definitely don't want to have notes in your documents that are, unprofessional. It doesn't matter if you're going to write, as usual, Bob acted like a jerk and I doubt he'll improve. I've even seen some serious, matters, case law that, an employer wrote, well, she looked like she was going to deliver at any minute and I certainly didn't want her in front of my customers. I mean, these are things that employers write in personnel files that really can bury you in the event that legal action is brought. So here's where the saving money part comes in, why it's important. If you've tuned into other webinars that I've presented, you have probably heard me say, in HR, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. So not only do you want to have a written account to provide to the employee, the corrective action internally, assuming it works, is a great thing, but in the event, eventually it leads to, to termination, the documentation can actually end up saving you money in the event they're alleging that you took some adverse action against them for some unlawful reason. For example, say you've terminated someone because they were tardy 8 times in a month, and then they were suspended for sleeping on the job. So you bring them back, they're given a final warning, and you say, one more thing, and you're fired. Then they get into a physical altercation with their manager, and this was the final straw, so you fire them. So the employee is now, disgruntled. They go to the EEOC, which is an agency that adjudicates the federal discrimination laws. And he alleges that he's 67 years old and you fired him because of his age. He writes out a detailed and dramatic account of how you always gave him harder work to do than the other younger employees. You and other people called him old geezer and said, isn't it about time you retired? So in order to have an appropriate defense, now this is shocking because you're like, this is the first I've ever heard of any of this, and clearly we fired him because he was late all these times, he's sleeping on the job, and he actually punched his manager. That seems really like a good idea, right? But in order to have a defense to his allegations, you want to be able to produce the documentation. So all the write-ups for his tardiness, the incident about, the sleeping and the fight and so on, that's your defense, because he's saying they fired me because I'm over 40, which is the protected class. And your response is, no, we fired him because of this, this, and this. And here's all the documentation that shows all the steps that we took to try to get him to improve, and yet he didn't, and therefore we terminated him. So you want to focus on confronting and fixing the problem, not punishing the employee, but also be sure that you have appropriate documentation in the event that, you've taken adverse action and you have to defend those actions, or defend allegations of some wrongful action taken. I think we have some time for some questions, and I'll turn this over to Nanette if she wants to go over some of those.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for submitting some questions to us. I've picked out some that we'll be answering now. We have about 10 minutes to answer some questions, and then if there's any questions that we don't get to, we'll be contacting you via email, and we'll get those responses out to you. All right, Christine, so the first question is, how many times do I have to write up an employee before I can fire them without worrying about being sued?
We do get this question a lot. Really, anytime you're terminating somebody, there is a risk of being sued. So again, that's why certainly the documentation is very important in order to defend a lawsuit. But there's no real rule or law about how many times is necessary. So again, that's why you want to follow the steps that we talked about, analyzing the various components, how serious it is, and determine what is appropriate. And certainly, like I mentioned, that some things would warrant immediate termination. Things that are serious enough, like if you have done an investigation and have shown that sexual harassment took place, there's not too many reasons, that are too many arguments to be made that's acceptable, and that it wouldn't warrant termination. So it really just depends on what steps you've taken so far.
Thank you, Christine. The next question, I had an employee who refused to sign the write-up, and at that point I really wanted to fire him. How should I have handled that situation?
Well, as I mentioned, sometimes the behavior of the employee during the coaching session can change the outcome. So if they really become belligerent or absolutely refuse to take the appropriate steps to correct the behavior, if you already know they aren't agreeing and they're like, I'm not going to do that, you might ultimately decide to terminate them at that time. That said, if they don't sign a write-up, it doesn't necessarily make it any less true, but it would indicate that maybe you've gotten to the point where they don't agree with the issue, or that it needs to be corrected, and so you might not make any progress moving forward. So you can make their signature on the document conditional of the employment relationship to continue, and because if they do it because they agree, then you can move forward with the process. So it kind of depends on their reaction and the circumstances, but again, it might just change the course of action.
Okay, and so the next question is, do I have to have a witness when I write up the employees?
Well, you don't necessarily have to, but it's certainly always a good idea. That way you have somebody, even though you're writing things down, if it's just you and the employee, you have another person there to corroborate, the events and what was discussed, and to, maybe later, you know, give testament to, yeah, that's what was discussed and so on. That's also another good reason to have the employee sign the document and to give them a copy, because again, that means everybody's acknowledging, yep, that's what we talked about, and yep, that's what we discussed and we agreed upon. So so always a good idea to give the employee a copy, and definitely a good idea to have another witness present.
Okay, Christine, the next question is actually a question that we get a lot. And it says, my employee was negligent in that she was not paying attention to her job and cost us a lot of money. Instead of writing her up, can I just deduct the amount of damages from her paycheck?
Yeah, we do get a lot of questions about this. In most states, you cannot deduct from an employee's pay without their written authorization. So unless you already have a policy or a form, that they acknowledge that you can deduct from your pay for damage of property, which also is not permitted in every state. But without that, you really can't deduct from their pay. And also no such deduction can take their wages below minimum wage. So in the event that it's a lot of money, you probably wouldn't recoup much of it. So if it's really that serious and it was a big enough amount of money, it may in fact warrant termination. But otherwise, if you don't think that it does, definitely, I would write the employee up and make it clear that if she, if something happens again because of her carelessness or not paying attention or whatever the case was, that, that it could lead to her termination.
Thank you, Christine. The next question is actually a two-part question. And the first part is there a specified time frame that I have to wait to write someone up? Or can I do 3 days of consecutive write-ups, and then would it be okay to fire the employee? That's the second part.
Well, as far as whether you can do the consecutive write-ups, I mean, if you're addressing the same issue over and over again, you want to you do want to address it right away. So there's no rule about it, but it doesn't. There's no reason to ever wait it out and see what happens if you haven't approached them about it. So you want to address, write them up, be clear what you expect and that you expect immediate improvement. Assuming it's something that can be fixed right away, like an attendance issue. But in terms of how long to wait, you really shouldn't. We have lots of employers that we've spoken to that, that, well, I 2 weeks ago this happened and now something else happened, but I never said anything. If you just let them get away with it, so to speak, you're sending a message that it's okay. Until you address it with them and tell them what you expect, they're probably going to keep doing it. So, and also, if you haven't addressed it at all, you might risk losing a defense to a lawsuit in the event you decide to term them later. We've seen plenty of occasions where, for example, an employee has a work comp claim, and which you can't term somebody because they have a work comp claim. And so then all of a sudden the employer wants to fire that person. We're like, well, they have a work comp claim. You can't do that. And they're like, well, they were always late and, they weren't doing a very good job. I was going to fire them anyway. We hear this a lot, but if you didn't do anything about it then, now is not the best time to do anything about it. So if you haven't already addressed it, you really could run into some problems if you really want to term them. So I don't recommend waiting. Address it right away and hopefully fix the problem.
The next question is, I have a supervisor who didn't write up an employee for some things that have been happening over the past several months. Can I write up 2 to 3 different write-ups now and be able to give them to the employee?
Well, obviously it would have been ideal that they address the issues as they occur, but if you now are just learning of the issues and the supervisor didn't address them, it would be appropriate to address them, all of them. I wouldn't make it as though it was a progressive approach. In other words, you don't want to say, well, those are your 3 strikes right there and I'm terminating you kind of thing. You could count it as one incident as the first step in the process, so to speak. But I would do, however, I would write up the supervisor. If it's the supervisor that isn't doing their job, that would probably warrant some corrective action with the supervisor for not addressing it appropriately with the employee. So you kind of have 2 tasks at hand under those circumstances.
Okay, the next question says, I had a situation where some employees were involved in an altercation. One of those employees had been with me a long time and is a good worker, so I wanted to fire everyone involved except him. Could I have just fired everyone else and wrote him up without it being illegal?
Well, chances are you will run into some problems if you're treating some employees better than others under the same or similar circumstances. So again, you want to make sure that you're consistent with your treatment of employees, that you have, here's what we do under these circumstances and we always do it, So you may have other evidence in their personnel files that some deserve termination and others didn't. In other words, if for example, you're a longtime employee, it was kind of the first issue you've ever had with him, and you don't feel like it's risen to the level of termination, but then the other employees, they've had multiple incidents of, issues with employees, and you might have a better chance, with something like that if you have something to differentiate um, the action that you take. But I definitely would, do so with caution if you plan to use different corrective measures for different employees, because at any time that happens, especially when termination is involved, you could be facing, some allegations of discriminatory treatment.
Okay, Christine, so now we're going to have one more question and then we'll give it over to Andrea. So this last question says, can we still write up an employee who was hurt on the job and has a workers' comp claim?
Well, we get this a lot as well. The short answer is yes. Having a work comp claim does not exempt employees from corrective action. It doesn't mean they don't have to follow the rules or that they don't have to do their job, but you just want to be sure that it doesn't appear that you're singling them out or that you're all of a sudden acting more severely towards them than you would have or than you had been before the injury. So if it was behavior that, they weren't previously written up for, like in my previous example, well, he's always late or he's never doing this, but I didn't write him up ever. Now would not be the time to start, changing your corrective action process with this individual because he does have that comp claim, which is a protected class. So changing things up immediately following the injury isn't necessarily the best choice. So again, this is why it's very important. This is one example of the importance to implement your corrective action procedures and always, do it the same way and stick with them and remain consistent. Andrea, you want to wrap it up for us?
Thank you, Christine. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, as always. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We are currently out of time, so if we couldn't get to your question, we will just answer it via email. And if you have any further questions or need assistance with anything, you can contact us at frankadvice@frankcrum.com, or you could contact anyone on our lovely HR team here that's on this slide directly. And in closing, at Frank Crum, we stand on our brand promise, and that is to inspire businesses like yours to be the best they can be. Have a wonderful day.